Hey guys, I did a film analysis on Red River Valley. So a little bit about this movie. It was made in 1997 and it was about the British incursion into Tibet in 1904. It was released under another title, A Tale of the Sacred Mountain. It was based on a book published by Peter Fleming in 1961 called Bayonets to Lhasa, the first full account of the British invasion of Tibet in 1904. So briefly on Orientalism, according to Said, it is a discourse governed by a battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections. It is also the Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So some of the themes that I examined in this movie were the savage, the exotic, erotic, and the romanticized representation. And each theme will be illustrated with one or two examples in this presentation. One thing that I really like about this movie is that while certain themes of Orientalism are present in the movie, some important elements of the movie seek to battle the dangerous effects of Orientalism. So the first theme, the savage, the barbarian, is deeply rooted in a concept of hegemony, which is, according to Said, the European superiority over Oriental backwardness. It is also related to the concept of us versus the other. Using Herbert's words, in the history of the world, the definition of what is human has often been applied to members of one's own culture and denied to others. Accordingly, other communities were often relegated to the animal or semi-human sphere, because their otherness or their culture was perceived as inferior. One example from the movie to illustrate this theme is a quote from Major Rockman. "Nearly 3 centuries have passed since then. Tibet is still a pagan enigma." This is what he says upon entering the border of Tibet. This is a rather subtle example, but a most important one, I think. Because the word pagan reminds us of Anne Taylor, a Christian missionary in Hopkirk's account. If you recall, she was determined to preach Christ's gospel inside the heathen capital, for beyond those protecting mountains lived a uniquely religious people awaiting, surely, rescue from their barbaric beliefs and practices and ready for conversion. To provide a little background on the definition of pagan or heathen, I think it's interesting how the missionary discourse goes hand in hand with Orientalism, in that the Protestant missionary discourse divides the world into Christians and non-Christians. Missionary literature frequently describes the non-Christian world as being immoral, benighted, idolatrous, pagan, barbaric, infidel, and a list of other terms that may be summarized by heathenism. So the perception of the other as barbarian and inferior provides a justification for the wars and invasions that we see in this movie. So another quote from Major Rockman: "Civilization is the ocean that drowns the wildness. It's inevitable." So you can see the proper response to savagery is to claim superiority and authority over the Orient and to conquer them with force. The second theme is the exotic, erotic. According to Herbert, the depiction of the exotic, erotic is ultimately the projection upon the other, his dissatisfaction with his own society, his existential boredom, and his dreams of fulfillment. It is also the imaginative construction of poetic images of sensual fulfillment unhindered by social constraints or necessity. An example is Snow Dawa's naked bath. It's interesting because she's actually of the Han ethnicity, but she was rescued and sort of adopted into a Tibetan family. So essentially, she is treated in this movie more like a Tibetan woman than a Han woman. So in terms of the depiction of nakedness of minority women, Herbert argues that minorities were objects of the erotic and in some cases sexual imagination. The unconcern towards nakedness characteristic of the Tibetans is attached to the desire to break out of the Han sexual taboos. And the third and last theme is the romantic Orientalism. According to Lopez, it stems from the failure of the European powers to dominate Tibet politically, and such failure only increased European longing and added to the fantasy about life in the land beyond the snowy range. And the romanticized representation is ultimately the Western projection of what it has failed to achieve. As explained by Lopez, the West perceives some kind of lack within itself and fantasizes that the answer, through a process of projection, is to be found somewhere in the East. The motifs are important examples because motifs are symbols or images that are recurring. They are in this way deliberately emphasized to convey and reinforce an idea. So for example, the prayer wheel is an important motif in this movie. It not only represents the sacred religious practice that was very popular in the Europeans' romantic imagination, it is also a symbol of timelessness in the European fantasy. In this version of the fantasy, Tibet is far away from the blows of modernity. As summarized by a quote I really like from Lopez, Tibet is a place that, even in the 20th century, had prayer wheels but no wheels on wagons, multiple metaphoric vehicles to liberation but no carts. Orientalism is problematic because, according to Said, it is an artificial enactment of what a non-Oriental has made into a symbol for the whole Orient. Therefore, what is portrayed is a represence by virtue of its having excluded, displayed, made supererogatory any such real thing as the Orient. So, the real danger of the depiction of Tibet in the style of Orientalism is ultimately the West speaking on behalf of Tibet. So where is its own voice, its own agency, its own identity? And why does its history matter? Those are the questions to think about as one starts to realize the danger and problems of Orientalism. However, while certain parts of this movie, as I discussed earlier, reflects the themes of Orientalism and is thus problematic, the movie does make an effort to counter those problems. For example, it gives the Tibetans their own voices as we listen to them sing their indigenous songs in front of the British invaders. Their faces are clearly portrayed and viewed at eye level. Most impressive of all is that the movie shows people taking initiatives and acting on their free will to do what they think is right. Their agency is demonstrated by them taking matters into their own hands. For example, the image on the right shows Danju, the chief's daughter, being captured after leading the battle with the British. So here goes my favorite quote in the movie from Jones, the translator and photographer of the British Army. He says, "This people will never give in. This is the Orient we shall never conquer."